The auctioneer's voice was the sound of flies buzzing on a festering wound, loud, persistent, and obscene. It echoed off the clabbered lies of prosperity, a town whose name was a cruel joke spat into the dust. On a crude wooden platform stood a woman, her silence a mountain in the face of the clamoring valley of men below. She was Apache. That much was clear from the proud line of her jaw and the defiant stillness in her dark eyes. She was also heavy with child, a truth announced by the swell of her belly beneath the worn buckskin dress. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" The auctioneer, a man named Barlow with a gut that strained the buttons of his grimy waistcoat, bellowed. "Strong back, good for working. And she comes with a bonus, a little papoose on the way. 2 for the price of 1. A wave of grimy laughter rolled through the crowd of prospectors and hard-luck ranchers. They were men whose dreams had curdled under the Arizona sun, leaving them bitter and mean. They saw not a woman, not a mother-to-be, but a commodity, a thing. "I'll give you a mule skinner's knife for her," one man yelled, showing yellowed teeth. "She ain't worth that," another cackled. "Look at her. Used goods." Josiah Washington stood at the edge of the crowd, a shadow leaning against the hot wall of the assayer's office. He was a freedman, a man who had walked out of the shadow of bondage with nothing but the calluses on his hands and a fire in his soul that the world had tried and failed to extinguish. He had seen auctions before, though the property then had been his own people, their skin the same deep, rich color as his. The memory was a brand on his heart, a constant, low-burning ache. He had come to prosperity for flour and salt, not for this. But the scene before him hooked into that old wound and pulled. 2 men, their faces flushed with cheap whiskey and the thrill of power, shoved their way to the front. They were the Flagg brothers, known for their cruelty to animals and men alike. Silas, the elder, held up a gleaming rifle. "1 Winchester 73, he snarled, his voice a gravelly boast. His brother, Caleb, hoisted another, and a second to match, for the squaw and whatever she's carrying. Barlow's eyes lit with greed. 2 rifles. A fine price for a fine piece of property. 2 rifles it is. Do I hear any advance? Going once, going twice." Josiah watched the woman on the platform. She didn't flinch. Her gaze was fixed on the distant, hazy line of the Dragoon Mountains, as if she could see through them to a place she once called home. Her hands rested, one over the other, on the curve of her belly, a gesture of unconscious, fierce protection. He saw not a specimen, but a fortress under siege. He saw the echo of his own mother, standing on a block in Georgia, her face a mask of stone to keep the world from seeing her shatter. The hammer was about to fall. The crowd surged with anticipation. The Flagg brothers grinned, already stepping forward to claim their prize. And then a voice, quiet but carrying the weight of stone, cut through the noise. "I'll pay in gold." Every head turned. The sea of pale, sun-scorched faces parted to stare at the tall, dark-skinned man who had pushed himself off the wall. Josiah met their stunned, hostile gazes without blinking. He walked forward, his worn boots scuffing the dirt, the silence he created more profound than the previous din. He stopped before the platform, his eyes not on the auctioneer, but on the woman. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a message meant only for her. "I see you." Barlow sputtered, his face purpling. "What's this? What did you say, boy?" Josiah ignored him. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt, the one that held every grain of hope he'd painstakingly sifted from the unforgiving earth. He opened it, and the afternoon sun caught the contents, making them glitter like a captured constellation. Gold dust, the result of 2 years of back-breaking labor on his solitary claim. "I'll pay in gold dust," he repeated, his voice level. "For the lady." The word hung in the air, shocking and alien. "Lady?" Silas Flagg's face contorted with rage. "He can't do that. We made a bid. She's ours." Barlow, however, was mesmerized by the shimmering dust. Greed was a more powerful master than prejudice. 2 rifles were good, but raw gold was the god this town worshipped. "How much?" he asked, his voice now a conspiratorial whisper. Josiah tipped the pouch, and a heavy, shining stream of dust poured onto the small brass-scale Barlow kept for just such occasions. It was more than a fair price. It was a fortune. It was everything he had. The crowd gasped. The weight of the gold settled the scale with a definitive clink. It was done. Barlow, his eyes wide, looked from the gold to Josiah, then to the woman. Sold, he croaked, his voice thick, to the freedman. And with a cascade of glittering dust and 2 quiet words, his life and hers were irrevocably changed. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The journey from the festering heart of prosperity to Josiah's homestead was a long, silent procession. He walked ahead, leading his mule, which was now laden with the flour and salt he had come for, as well as the woman he had just bought. He had offered her the saddle, but she had refused with a slow, deliberate shake of her head. She walked behind him, her steps even and measured despite her condition, her eyes scanning the landscape, memorizing every rock and cactus as if it were a map to a place she could never return. The stares followed them out of town, vicious, venomous things that pricked at the back of Josiah's neck. He heard the muttered words, snatched by the wind. Nerve of him, bought himself an engine. What's this world coming to? He ignored them. He had been ignoring words like that his entire life. They were just noise like the buzzing of flies. It was the silence between him and the woman that was heavy, filled with 1,000 unspoken questions. His claim was nestled deep in a small, arid canyon, a good 2-hour walk from the nearest neighbor, and that suited Josiah just fine. The land was harsh, all red rock and thorny scrub, but it was his. The one-room cabin he had built with his own hands was small and solid, its back against a rock wall, as if for protection. A small, sturdy corral held his horse, a stoic roan gelding named Abel, and a lean-to sheltered the mule. This small patch of earth was the only kingdom he had ever known. When they arrived, the sun was a fiery smear on the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple. He slid the supplies off the mule, then turned to the woman. She had stopped a few feet from the cabin, her posture wary, like a doe scenting a wolf. Her gaze flicked from the cabin to the corral, to the small, tilled patch where he grew beans and corn, taking in every detail. Josiah gestured toward the open door of the cabin. "This is it," he said, his voice feeling rough from disuse. He realized it was the first time he had spoken directly to her since his bid. She did not move. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw past the wall of stoicism to the raw fear behind it. She was in the den of a stranger, a man of a different race who had purchased her like a sack of grain. What did he want from her? What price would he exact beyond the gold dust? Josiah understood the question in her eyes. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of newly freed men and women facing a world where freedom was just another word for a different kind of cage. He let the silence stretch, giving her time. Then he acted. He walked past her and into the cabin. It was spare, containing only a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and a narrow cot in one corner. In the other was a pile of clean blankets. He picked up the blankets and walked back to the doorway. He pointed to the cot. "That's yours," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Then he walked outside, laid his own blankets on the ground beneath the lean-to's overhang, a good 20 feet from the cabin door. He made his bed for the night there, under the stars, leaving the solid walls and the door to her. He didn't look back to see her reaction. He simply gave her the space, the choice. He went about his chores, tending to Abel and the mule, his movements deliberate and unhurried. When he was done, he built a small fire and put a pot of beans on to cook. The aroma, rich with salt pork, began to drift on the cooling air. He ate his portion straight from the pot, his back to the cabin. After a long while, he heard the softest of sounds, the scuff of a moccasin on the hard-packed earth. He didn't turn. He simply pushed a tin plate with a generous portion of beans and a piece of cornbread toward the open space beside him. He waited. The seconds ticked by, measured by the crackle of the fire. Then a shadow fell over the plate. A hand reached down, slender, with long fingers, and took it. The shadow retreated back into the darkness of the cabin doorway. It was a beginning, a fragile truce declared not with words, but with a shared meal and a gesture of trust. In the vast, lonely silence of the canyon, under a blanket of stars, a man who had been property and a woman who was being treated as such began the slow, arduous task of seeing each other not as a buyer and his purchase, but as two solitary souls adrift in a hostile world. The night deepened, and Josiah lay on his bedroll, listening to the desert's quiet symphony. He heard no sound from the cabin, but he knew she was there. And for the first time in a long time, the crushing weight of his solitude felt a little bit lighter. The first few days established a rhythm of quiet coexistence. Josiah rose before the sun, his movements economical as he started the fire, put coffee on to boil, and saw to his animals. He found she was always awake, a silent figure in the cabin doorway, watching the day be born. He would leave a plate of food and a mug of coffee on the stoop, and she would retrieve it only after he had walked away. They were like two planets orbiting the same sun, held in place by a gravity of shared circumstance, but never touching. He did not know her name. He called her ma'am in his own head, a title of respect she could not hear. She, in turn, was a cipher. Her face was a mask of careful neutrality, her grief and fear buried deep. But Josiah was a patient man, taught by the land to read the subtle signs. He saw the way her hand would stray to her belly whenever a hawk cried overhead, a primal instinct to shield her young. He noticed that she would gather fallen mesquite branches and arrange them in a neat pile by the hearth, a small, unspoken contribution. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled down from the mountains. Rain came in blinding sheets, turning the dry creek bed into a raging brown torrent. A gust of wind tore at the cabin, and a section of the sod roof, weakened by the dry heat, gave way. Water poured into a corner of the small room. Josiah was outside, struggling to secure a tarp over his precious corn patch. He heard a cry from inside, not of fear, but of alarm. He ran into the cabin, soaked to the skin, to find her frantically moving his sacks of flour and cornmeal away from the deluge. A stream of muddy water was cascading directly onto his winter provisions. Without a word, they worked together. He scrambled onto a chair, trying to stuff the hole with spare rags while she, moving with surprising speed, dragged the heavy sacks to the driest part of the room. The wind howled, the rain hammered down, and in the chaos of the storm, the careful distance they had maintained was washed away. He slipped, his boots sliding on the wet floor, and his arm brushed against hers. She flinched, a sharp, involuntary recoil, but she didn't run. Her eyes met his for a split second, and in them he saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else, determination. They had a shared enemy now, the storm that threatened their shelter and food. When the worst of it was over, they stood in the damp, dim light of the cabin, breathing heavily. The leak had slowed to a stubborn drip. A third of the floor was a muddy mess. "Thank you," Josiah said, looking at the saved sacks of flour. She gave a short, sharp nod, her gaze fixed on the dripping ceiling. It was the closest they had come to a conversation. He felt a shift in the air between them, subtle but real. They had weathered a small crisis together. She had acted not as a guest or a captive, but as a partner in survival. Later that evening, as he sat by the fire patching the hole in his roof with a mixture of mud and grass, he heard her humming. It was a low, mournful tune, a song without words that spoke of loss and longing. It was the sound of her soul cracking open just a little, letting some of the sorrow out. Josiah didn't look at her. He just kept working, his hands moving rhythmically, his heart listening to the sad, beautiful music that filled the canyon. He was beginning to understand that her silence wasn't empty. It was full of a history he couldn't imagine, a pain he could only respect. And in that moment, he reaffirmed the choice he had made in the dusty street of prosperity. He hadn't just bought her freedom. He had taken on the responsibility of protecting the world she carried inside her. The cost was everything he had, and he was beginning to realize it wasn't nearly enough. Weeks bled into a month. The raw, high-desert sun beat down, and the rhythm of their life settled into a pattern of shared tasks and vast, echoing silences. But the silence was changing. It was no longer the tense, wary quiet of strangers, but the more comfortable silence of two people learning the landscape of each other's presence. Josiah learned things about her not through words, but through observation. He learned she had a deep and abiding knowledge of the land. One morning, he watched from a distance as she knelt by a cluster of what he'd always considered weeds. With careful fingers, she dug up the roots, washed them in the basin of water he left for her, and set them in the sun to dry. Later, she crushed them into a powder. That evening, when he felt a feverish chill coming on from a long day's work under the relentless sun, he found a cup of warm, bitter tea waiting on the table. He drank it, and by morning, the fever was gone. She had healed him with a knowledge he did not possess. In return, she learned about him. She saw the way he spoke to his horse, Abel, in a low, gentle murmur, his hand stroking the gelding's neck with an affection he showed no human. She watched him painstakingly repair a broken strap on his saddle, his large hands surprisingly nimble, his focus absolute. She saw his honesty. When a traveling peddler stopped by the canyon, a rare and startling event, Josiah traded a few of his precious beans for a small bag of sugar. The peddler, a shifty-eyed man, tried to shortchange him. Josiah simply held the man's gaze, his expression unmoving, until the peddler, flustered, corrected his mistake and scurried away. Josiah had power, she realized, but it was a quiet, unshakable kind, rooted in his own certainty of what was right. The baby grew within her, a constant, living presence that connected and separated them. Her condition was a stark reminder of her past and an unknown future. For Josiah, it was a symbol of his responsibility. He began leaving a small portion of milk from the goat he'd bartered for in a clean tin cup for her each morning. He started hunting more, bringing back rabbits and quail to ensure she had enough to eat, his rifle a tool for provision, not violence. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, she was sitting on the cabin stoop, weaving thin strips of yucca fiber into a small, intricate basket. Her fingers moved with a practiced, hypnotic grace. Josiah sat nearby, sharpening a blade on a whetstone, the shhhgay of steel on stone, a rhythmic counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. "My husband," she said, her voice so soft he thought at first he'd imagined it. He stopped his work, the silence suddenly immense. He did not look at her, sensing that his gaze might frighten the words away. He kept his eyes on the blade in his hands. "He taught me to track," she continued, her voice a low murmur. He could read the story of the land. A broken twig, a scuff in the sand. It was a language to him, her fingers stilled on the basket. The bluecoats, they did not read the land. They only burned it. There it was, a piece of her history, offered up like a fragile, precious stone. Josiah's heart ached for her, for the man she had lost, for the world that had been stolen from her. He searched for the right words, but knew that none would suffice. So he offered the only thing he could, the truth of his own experience. "My father," he said, his voice raspy. "He was a blacksmith. Strongest man I ever knew. He could make iron bend to his will. But he couldn't make himself a free man. They sold him south. I never saw him again." He looked up then and met her eyes. In their dark, liquid depths, he saw his own sorrow reflected. It was a grief of a different shape and color, but it came from the same deep well of injustice. In that moment, the chasm between them, of race, of culture, of language, shrank. They were no longer just a freedman and an Apache woman. They were Josiah and, he still didn't know her name, but they were two people who understood what it meant to have everything taken from you. A new closeness began to form in the wake of that shared confidence, a fragile shoot pushing its way through hardened ground. She began to take her meals at the same table, sitting opposite him, the wooden plank a bridge between their two solitudes. She showed him which plants were good for seasoning, which berries were sweet, and which snakes were deadly. He, in turn, taught her the English words for things: table, fire, water, horse. She would repeat them softly, her pronunciation careful, tasting the foreign sounds on her tongue. But their growing peace was a delicate bubble in a world full of sharp edges. One hot, still afternoon, a rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. It was not the peddler. Josiah saw him from a distance, and his hand went instinctively to the rifle propped against the cabin wall. The rider was Silas Flagg. He rode his horse with a belligerent arrogance, reining it in a few yards from the cabin. His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, swept over the scene: the neat woodpile, the small garden, and Josiah standing guard by the door. Then his gaze fell on the woman, who had risen from her seat on the stoop and now stood slightly behind Josiah, her face impassive. A cruel, possessive smirk twisted Silas's lips. "Well now," Silas drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Josiah's boot. "Look at this cozy little setup. Playing house, are we?" "State your business, Flagg," Josiah said, his voice cold and flat. "Just check in on my property," Silas sneered, his eyes lingering on the woman's swollen form. "Or what should have been my property? You cheated me, Freedman. Used that flashy dust to steal what was rightly won." "She was never your property," Josiah said, his grip tightening on the rifle stock. "And she ain't for sale." Silas chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Ain't she? An Indian squaw? They're all for sale, one way or another. I just came by to let you know, people in town are talking. They don't take kindly to your kind getting above himself, or to coddling savages. A man ought to be careful. A place this far out, accidents can happen. A fire, maybe. A stray bullet. Things go missing." The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. He was talking about her. It was a direct challenge, a promise of future violence. The woman took a half-step forward, emerging from behind Josiah's shoulder. She looked directly at Silas Flagg, her chin lifted. She said nothing, but her eyes blazed with a fire so fierce and pure that Silas actually shifted in his saddle, his smirk faltering for a second. It was the look of a warrior, a queen, a mother defending her territory. Silas quickly regained his bravado. "You watch your back," he spat at Josiah. He wheeled his horse around, kicking up a cloud of red dust, and galloped away. The dust settled, leaving a profound and terrible silence. The peace of the canyon was shattered. The outside world, with all its hatred and ugliness, had found them. Josiah looked at the woman. Her face was pale, but her eyes were still burning. He saw the fear she was trying to hide, the trembling in her hands that she quickly stilled. The fragile bubble had burst. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Silas Flagg would be back, and he would not come alone. The gold dust had bought her body out of an auction, but it was a different kind of payment that would be required to secure her life and the life of her child. A payment that might be measured in blood. The wake of Silas Flagg's visit was a cold dread that settled over the canyon like a winter fog. The comfortable silences were gone, replaced by a tense watchfulness. Every snap of a twig, every shadow that danced on the canyon walls, was a potential threat. Josiah slept even more lightly now, his rifle no longer propped against the wall, but lying beside his bedroll, its cold steel a constant, grim companion. He saw the toll the fear was taking on her. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes, and she moved with a new, heavy weariness. The baby was due soon, and her vulnerability was a raw, open wound. His feelings for her had deepened into something fierce and protective, a feeling that went far beyond responsibility. Her quiet strength, her resilience, the way she had carved out a space of dignity in the heart of degradation. It had worked its way into the lonely corners of his soul. The thought of Flagg and his cronies laying their filthy hands on her was an outrage that burned in his gut like acid. This small, isolated patch of land had become a sanctuary, and he would defend it. But he knew he was just one man. One evening, as a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, she approached him as he sat by the fire. She carried the small basket she was always weaving. It was finished now, a beautiful, tightly woven thing. She held it out to him. "My name is Nalin," she said. Her voice was clear and steady. Josiah took the basket, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection in the midst of their shared fear. He looked at her, truly seeing the woman who had given him her name. "Nalin." It sounded like a prayer. "Josiah," he said, his own name feeling solid and real on his tongue. "Josiah," she repeated softly. "I know what that man wants. He will come back. I won't let him take you," he said, the promise a raw vow. "We are not strong enough," she said, her pragmatism a stark and painful truth. "You are one man. I am one woman with a child." She placed a hand on her belly. "There's a place, a hidden canyon, 2 days' walk from here. My people used it as a refuge. I can find it. We can go." He considered her words. Fleeing was the sensible option. They could disappear into the wilderness, leave Flag and the hatred of prosperity behind. But Josiah looked around at the small world he had built, the sturdy cabin, the tended garden, the corral that held his faithful horse. He had been running his whole life, running from the lash, running from poverty, running from the scornful eyes of a world that refused to see him as a man. This place, this small claim, was the first time he had ever stopped running. It was the first piece of the earth that was his. To run again felt like a deeper kind of defeat. "No," he said, his voice firm. "This is our home. We don't run." Nalin looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She saw the stubborn pride, the unshakable resolve. It was a dangerous kind of courage, the kind that got men killed. But it was also the same courage that had made him step forward at the auction. "Then we must be more than we are," she said, her meaning clear. Their current arrangement was a fragile thing, easily broken by the laws and prejudices of men like Flag. He had bought her, a transaction that could be disputed. A freedman and an Apache woman living together was a scandal that invited violence. But a husband and a wife, that was different. Marriage was a fortress, recognized by law, blessed by God. It was a shield. The idea was a thunderclap in the quiet of his mind. Marry her? Marry this woman he barely knew, a woman from another world, who carried another man's child. It was a drastic, desperate measure. But as he looked at her fierce, proud face, at the life she carried so protectively, he knew it was the only way. It was a risk, a leap into an unknown future, but the alternative was a certainty of violence and loss. "There's a preacher," he said, his voice low. "I see. He's doing the settlement of Tres Hermanas in 3 days' time. It's a day's ride from here." He wasn't asking a question. He was laying out a plan, a tactical decision born of desperation. He was offering her the only protection he could forge, his name. Nalin held his gaze, her expression unreadable. This was not a proposal of love or affection, but a treaty for survival. A joining of 2 solitary nations against a common enemy. She thought of the child within her, a child who would be born into a world that wanted to crush him before he could even draw breath. This man, Josiah, was offering her child a name, a home, a father's protection. Slowly, she nodded. 3 days, she said. The decision was made. A quiet, resolute pact made by a dying fire under a desert moon. They would ride to Tres Hermanas. They would stand before a man of God and bind their lives together, not for love, but for sanctuary. It was a desperate gamble, a fortress built of necessity, and as they stood on the precipice of this profound choice, they could both feel the world shifting under their feet. The showdown was no longer a matter of if, but when, and they had chosen to face it together. The ride to Tres Hermanas was a tense, hurried affair. Josiah rode able, his rifle resting across the saddle horn. He had insisted Nalin ride the mule, despite her protest that she could walk. The journey was too long, her condition too advanced. She acquiesced, her silence conveying a reluctant gratitude. The landscape they moved through felt menacing. Every rock formation a potential ambush, every distant dust devil a sign of approaching riders. Josiah's eyes constantly scanned the horizon, his jaw tight with concentration. They arrived in Tres Hermanas as dusk was falling. It was smaller and quieter than Prosperity, a collection of adobe houses and a single, dusty main street. At its center stood a small, whitewashed adobe church, its simple wooden cross stark against the darkening sky. The circuit preacher, a thin, weary-looking man named Reverend Michael, was standing outside, speaking with a few of the town's elders. Josiah dismounted, his presence immediately drawing curious and suspicious stares. A black man and an Apache woman arriving together. It was a sight that demanded explanation. He helped Nalin down from the mule, his hand briefly touching the small of her back, a gesture of support that felt both shockingly intimate and profoundly necessary. He walked directly to the preacher, Nalin a half-step behind him, her head held high. "Reverend," Josiah said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "My name is Josiah Washington. This is Nalin. We've come to be married." The Reverend's eyebrows shot up. His gaze flickered from Josiah's dark face to Nalin's unmistakable Apache features and her swollen belly. The town elders behind him exchanged scandalized glances. An audible murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. "Mary," Reverend Michael repeated, his voice laced with disbelief and disapproval. "Son, do you understand what you're asking?" "Understand perfectly," Josiah said, his voice unwavering. "We wish to be joined in the sight of God." "This is highly irregular," one of the elders, a stern-faced rancher, interjected. "A freedman and her. It ain't right." "The Lord's house is for all his children," Josiah countered, his eyes locking with the preacher's. "But does the word of God not apply out here in the desert? Is your God a respecter of persons, Reverend?" The challenge was direct, a question of faith and hypocrisy. The Reverend flushed, clearly uncomfortable. He was a man of God, but he was also a man living in a world full of harsh prejudices. He looked at Nalin, at her quiet dignity, and then at Josiah, at the fierce determination in his eyes. He saw not lust or foolishness, but a desperate sincerity. Before the preacher could answer, a cloud of dust at the end of the street announced the arrival of more riders. Josiah's blood ran cold. It was Silas Flagg, and he had brought 4 other men with him. They rode into the small town square with a swaggering impunity, their faces grim and set. "Well, look what we have here," Flagg sneered, dismounting and striding toward them. His eyes were burning with a triumphant malice. Someone from Prosperity must have seen them leave and sent word. "Trying to make an honest woman of her, Freedman? It's a little late for that. She belongs to me. I won her fair and square before you swooped in with your stolen dust." "She belongs to no one," Josiah said, stepping in front of Nalin, shielding her with his body. "We've come to be married. It's our right." "Right?" Flagg laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You ain't got no rights. And she sure as hell don't. She's an Apache, a savage. You can't marry a thing like that. It's against nature. It's against God." He turned to the preacher. "You ain't gonna perform this mockery, are you, Reverend? The good people of this territory won't stand for it." The townspeople shifted uneasily, caught between the preacher's authority and Flagg's naked aggression. The Reverend looked pale and frightened, his moral convictions warring with his fear of the violent men before him. Josiah knew he was losing. The law was a fickle thing, easily bent by the will of men like Flagg. He had one last card to play, not of law, but of honor. He turned to face the crowd, his voice ringing out in the tense silence. "You see this woman?" he said, his hand gesturing toward Nalin. "Men in Prosperity put her on a block and try to sell her. For 2 rifles. They saw a thing to be used. I saw a human soul. I paid for her with 2 years of my life's work, every grain of gold I had, not to own her, but to set her free from men like him." He pointed a finger at Flagg. "This man doesn't want justice. He wants a slave. He talks about God, but he practices the work of the devil. I was born a slave. I know what it looks like. I know what it feels like, and I will not stand by and watch another human being be put in chains, not while I draw breath." His words hung in the air, a testament of truth spoken with the unimpeachable authority of lived experience. The crowd was silent, their faces a mixture of shock, shame, and grudging respect. He had exposed the rotten core of Flagg's argument, laying bare his greed and cruelty for all to see. Then, Nalin did something unexpected. She stepped out from behind Josiah, her face a mask of serene courage. She looked not at Flagg, but at the preacher, at the women in the crowd. She laid a hand on her belly. "This man," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the square, her English careful and precise. "Josiah. He gave me shelter when I had none. He gave me food when I was hungry. He gave me respect when the world gave me scorn. He protects my child." Her gaze swept over the faces of the townspeople. "You speak of what is right. Is it right to tear a mother from her child? Is it right to sell a life for a gun? This man, Josiah Washington, is a good man. Un honorable man. I choose to be his wife." Her words were a thunderclap. She was not a passive object being fought over. She was a woman, making a choice, declaring her will. She claimed her own agency, her own voice. The women in the crowd looked at her belly, at her proud, tearless eyes, and something shifted. They saw not a savage, but a mother. The Reverend Michael looked from Nalin's defiant face to Josiah's steady one. He saw the ugly sneer on Silas Flagg's face, and the conviction in his heart finally won out over his fear. He straightened his shoulders, and his voice, when he spoke, was filled with a newfound strength. "The sacrament of marriage is a sacred covenant," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "It is not for me, or for any man, to deny it to those who seek it in good faith. Mr. Flagg, you're on holy ground. You will show respect, or you will be removed." He turned his back on Flagg and faced Josiah and Nalin. "Come," he said, gesturing to the church door. "Let us go into the house of the Lord." Silas Flagg stood there, sputtering, his face mottled with fury. His power had been broken, not by force of arms, but by the force of two people's courage and the simple, undeniable power of their shared truth. He had been shamed, his hypocrisy exposed in front of the entire town. One of his own men looked away, refusing to meet his eye. Their unity was fractured. With a final, venomous glare, Flagg turned, mounted his horse, and rode out of town, his men trailing behind him like a pack of defeated dogs. The threat was not gone, but it had been vanquished for today. Josiah took Nalin's hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. Together, they walked past the silent, watching crowd and through the doors of the small adobe church. The air inside was cool and smelled of dust and old wood. As they stood before the simple altar, the last rays of the setting sun streamed through the window, bathing them in a soft, golden light. Their bond, forged in desperation, was about to be sanctified, a quiet act of defiance that echoed like a rifle shot across the silent desert. Inside the cool, dim sanctuary of the church, the world fell away. There was only the quiet breathing of the three of them, Josiah, Nalin, and the weary but resolute Reverend Michael. He did not ask for rings they did not have. He did not ask for witnesses beyond the silent saints painted on the adobe walls and the God he served. He simply opened his worn Bible and began. Josiah stood tall, his hand still holding Nalin's. He felt the fine tremor in her fingers and squeezed gently, a silent message of reassurance. He listened to the ancient words of the ceremony, words about devotion, honor, and cleaving to one another in sickness and in health. They were words meant for lovers, for couples who had chosen each other out of affection and hope. For them, they were a shield, a legal and spiritual fortress against the wolves outside. But as the Reverend spoke, Josiah looked at Nalin, at the proud, strong line of her profile illuminated by the candlelight, and felt a truth that went deeper than necessity. He did wish to honor her. He would cherish her. He would protect her until his last breath. The marriage of convenience was becoming something more, something real, in the crucible of that moment. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, the words settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, profound finality. It was done. They were bound together. Josiah turned to Nalin. In her dark eyes, he saw not just gratitude, but a deep, unguarded vulnerability. He saw the woman who had lost everything, who had been sold and scorned, and who had stood before a hostile crowd and claimed her own life. Without thinking, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he lifted her hand, turned it over, and pressed a gentle kiss to the palm. It was a gesture of fealty, of profound respect. A tear, the first he had ever seen her shed, welled in her eye and traced a shining path down her cheek. They left the church as Mr. and Mrs. Washington, stepping back out into the purple twilight. The townspeople were still there, but their expressions had changed. The hostility was gone, replaced by a grudging respect, even a quiet awe. A few of the women nodded to Nalin as she passed. They had found their justice, not through violence, but through courage and truth. The journey back to the canyon was different. The silence was no longer tense, but filled with a new, shared gravity. They were husband and wife. The words felt strange and momentous. When they finally saw the familiar shape of their small cabin, nestled in the protective curve of the canyon, it looked different. It looked like home. That night, for the first time, Josiah did not sleep outside. After he tended to the animals, he walked into the cabin. Nalin was sitting on the edge of the cot. The one he had always insisted was hers. The room was small, the space between them charged with a new and unfamiliar intimacy. He stopped by the table, unsure of the new rules that governed their lives. She looked up at him. "This is your home, Josiah," she said softly. "Your bed." She gestured to the cot. He shook his head. He walked to the corner and laid out his bedroll on the floor, in the same spot he always had. "Tonight," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "and for all nights, this home is ours. We share it." He was giving her the choice, even now. He was her husband, but he would not be her master. He was honoring the vow he had made not just to the preacher, but to himself. A small, true smile touched Nalin's lips. She lay down on the cot, pulling the blanket up. Josiah laid down on his bedroll, the floor hard beneath him. They were separated by only a few feet of wooden planks, but for the first time, they were truly together, sheltered under the same roof, bound by the same name. 2 days later, under the bright, unforgiving light of the desert sun, Nalin's labor began. It came on fast and hard. There was no time for fear, only for action. Josiah, his heart hammering against his ribs, brought clean water and tore strips from his cleanest shirt. He remembered things his mother had told him, fragments of birthing lore from a lifetime ago. He held her hand, wiped the sweat from her brow, and spoke to her in a low, steady murmur, telling her she was strong, that she was safe. She labored with the same fierce, quiet courage with which she lived her life. And as the sun reached its zenith, a new sound filled the small cabin, the thin, powerful cry of a newborn. "Asson." Josiah looked at the tiny, perfect child, his skin a beautiful blend of his mother's rich tones and something fairer, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. He looked at Nalin, exhausted but radiant, as she held her son to her breast. The ghost of the auction, the specter of Silas Flagg, the hatred of the world, it all faded into insignificance in the face of this miracle, this new life. Nalin looked up at him, her eyes shining. "His name is Chayton," she whispered. "It means hawk." She shifted the baby in her arms. Chayton Washington. She had given her son his name. She had given him a bridge between two worlds, a name of strength from her past, and a name of protection for his future. Later, as Nalin and the baby slept peacefully, Josiah stepped outside. The canyon was bathed in the soft light of late afternoon. He looked at his hands, calloused and worn from a life of hard labor. They had built this home. They had worked the land, and they had helped bring a new life into the world. He thought of the pouch of gold dust, long since spent. It was a pittance, a handful of glittering dirt. He looked back into the cabin, at the woman and the child sleeping in the soft light. This, he thought, was true wealth, a treasure beyond measure. He had paid for a life, and in return, he had been given a universe. The quiet man, the Freedman Cowboy, stood before his home, his heart full, finally to bursting. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a husband. He was a father. He was home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.